12:47 p.m., March 14, 1944. A German bunker loomed across the Rapido River, reinforced steel, near impossible to penetrate. Inside, an untouchable observer waited. One American sniper, a Boston pool hall prodigy, lined up a shot through a gap no wider than a playing card. In seconds, history would change, and hundreds of lives would be saved. This is the story of James Keller, a Boston pool hall prodigy who would change the rules of sniping forever, applying angles and calculations that even West Point instructors had never imagined. He grew up in a cramped, three-room tenement in Charlestown, Massachusetts, where the air always carried the sharp mix of boiled cabbage and motor oil. His father labored 16-hour days at the Navy Yard docks, handling munitions for meager Depression-era wages, while young James watched, learned, and quietly honed a mind that saw the world in lines, angles, and trajectories. While other children ran the streets playing stickball, 12-year-old Jimmy was calculating angles and predicting rebounds, sinking combination shots that defied every law of straight-line physics. The hall's owner, Frank Murphy, quickly recognized the boy's extraordinary vision. "Most people see the ball and the pocket," he told Jimmy once, "but you see every path it could take, every possible ricochet between here and there." Jimmy never completed high school, leaving at 16 to cover his father's grueling shift after a back injury forced the old man off the docks. By 1942, he was running a rigging crew, deciphering engineering blueprints, and calculating precise load-bearing angles for ship repairs. The day Pearl Harbor shook the nation, Jimmy enlisted without hesitation. Seeing crane operator on his application, the recruiter sent him to Fort Benning for infantry training. It was there, on the rifle range, that everything changed. Keller's marksmanship scores were so flawless, the instructors briefly suspected cheating. But it wasn't just his accuracy that turned heads. What truly set Keller apart were his unorthodox shooting positions. While most recruits stuck to prone, kneeling, or standing, Jimmy sought unconventional angles, firing around obstacles, beneath cover, and even using reflective surfaces to his advantage. Every shot was calculated, precise, almost like he was solving a geometry problem rather than fighting a war. One sergeant even noted in his file, "This kid doesn't just shoot, he visualizes the battlefield." Recognizing his rare talent, the Army made him a sniper, sending him first to North Africa, then Sicily, and finally up the Italian mainland with the 36th Infantry Division. By March 1944, Keller already had 19 confirmed kills to his name. By all conventional measures, Keller's record was standard, nothing extraordinary. He followed textbook sniper doctrine: find an elevated position, establish the range, adjust for wind, and squeeze the trigger. The Germans fell, the war pressed on, but then came the Rapido River Valley. The Gustav Line fortifications stood as a testament to 18 months of meticulous German engineering. Every bunker, pillbox, and observation post had been crafted by men who knew that strategic placement and reinforced concrete could outmatch sheer firepower. For weeks, the Allies bombarded these positions with artillery, creating massive craters, yet the German defenders remained nearly untouchable. The Germans remained hidden underground, emerging only after the bombardments ceased to resume their deadly work. Monte Cassino loomed over the valley, a commanding vantage point from which German observers tracked every American movement with lethal precision. Among these fortifications, one observation post, labeled Strong Point 7 in Allied intelligence, perched in a concrete bunker carved into the mountainside, just 480 yards from the American lines. From inside, the German spotter had an unobstructed view of the valley floor, and any attempt by Allied forces to advance triggered artillery strikes within 90 seconds. According to standard sniper doctrine, the objective was clear: suppress the observer. But Strong Point 7 had been engineered by someone who truly understood ballistics. Its firing slit faced away from the most likely sniper positions, and the reinforced concrete walls, 3 feet thick, rendered even a perfect shot nearly impossible. The slit itself measured just 18 inches wide by 8 inches tall, and the German spotter deliberately stayed back, hidden from any direct line of fire. The first to attempt the impossible was Lieutenant Marcus Chen of the 141st Infantry Regiment. On the morning of March 1st, 1944, at 6:15 a.m., Lieutenant Chen took position 520 yards to the northeast. He carefully calculated a shot through the firing slit, timing it for the brief moment when the morning light might silhouette the German observer. He fired, and the bullet struck 6 inches to the left, ricocheting harmlessly off the concrete. Within 8 seconds, return fire erupted. German snipers had been watching for any sign of a muzzle flash. Chen fell, a single bullet through his throat, ending the life of the 23-year-old from Sacramento, engaged to a nurse named Dorothy, who would receive the telegram 9 days later. The next attempt would come from Sergeant William Morrison on March 4th, 1944, at 2:30 p.m. Sergeant William Morrison believed that suppressive fire might force the German back long enough for an assault team to advance. Over 40 seconds, he fired 17 rounds, all aimed at the narrow firing slit. 3 bullets struck the bunker, but none touched the observer. In retaliation, the Germans called down a mortar barrage, instantly killing Morrison and 2 men from his squad. Morrison, 31, hailed from Tulsa and left behind a 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, who would treasure his last letter for 6 decades. The third attempt came from Private First Class Eddie Donovan on the morning of March 8, 1944. 20 years old and a former Golden Gloves boxer from Brooklyn, Donovan abandoned the idea of firing through the slit. Instead, he tried to advance under the cover of smoke, closing the distance to within grenade range. German machine gun fire sliced through the smoke at knee height, and Donovan fell, bleeding out in a crater just 15 yards from the bunker. His body would not be recovered for 4 days. Keller had watched Sergeant Morrison die the day before. The two had shared a foxhole the previous night, swapping stories of home. Morrison had shown him photographs, his daughter swinging on a tire, his wife in a Sunday dress. "I'm teaching Sarah to fish, taking her to Lake Texoma, spending a whole summer doing nothing," Morrison had said, smiling. By morning, Morrison was laid to rest in a mass grave alongside 17 other soldiers, 3 snipers, and 14 infantrymen killed in repeated assault attempts. The German observer remained untouchable. Every briefing repeated the same grim assessment. Strong Point 7 retained full fire control capability. No solution had been found. Keller spent 6 days studying the bunker, sketching diagrams on cigarette packs and calculating angles with a carpenter's protractor borrowed from an engineering unit. The challenge wasn't the bunker's concrete walls or firing slit. It was that everyone else was thinking in straight lines. Direct fire, direct assault, direct suppression. Keller knew the answer required thinking entirely differently. The bunker's concrete roof was reinforced with steel I-beams, and while the German engineers had carefully offset the firing slit to block any direct shots, structural gaps remained where the beams met the walls. Keller studied these openings meticulously. "There's a 3-inch gap, 18 inches above the firing slit," he explained. "If I position myself at bearing 247, with an elevation advantage of 32 feet, I can fire through that gap. The round will glance off the I-beam's inner angle and redirect downward through the firing slit at roughly 40 degrees. Hayes leaned over the diagram, incredulous. You want to back a rifle round off a steel beam, like a pull shot? Keller nodded. Yes, sir. Hayes shook his head slowly. That's insane. It's geometry, sir, Keller replied, not recklessness. Hayes shook his head. It's court-martial territory. If you waste ammunition on trick shots while men are dying, Keller cut him off quietly, meeting his eyes. Men are dying because we keep doing the same thing. Morrison died because we refused to think in angles. Chen died because we were predictable. Donovan died because we ran out of ideas. Hayes said nothing for nearly half a minute, the weight of the losses hanging between them. Finally, he exhaled. You get one shot, Corporal. One. If you miss, you're back on standard patrol. If you hit, we'll talk. And if you get yourself killed trying, I'll write your mother explaining that you died attempting something that shouldn't have worked. Keller straightened. Understood, sir. Hayes turned back to his maps. Conversation over. Dismissed from the tent, Keller spent the entire night working through the math. The structural gap he was aiming for was barely 3 inches wide. At a distance of 480 yards, it might as well have been a coin floating in the dark. If he struck the exact point where the I-beam met the concrete wall, the bullet would ricochet off the inner angle and drop roughly 43 degrees into the bunker. Miss by even a fraction of an inch, and the shot would die against solid steel. Inside, the German observer would be standing about 6 feet back from the firing slit, exactly where doctrine said he would be, safe from direct fire, confident that no one could reach him. A bullet dropping in at a 43-degree angle would hit the observer square in the torso, but only if every variable aligned perfectly. The valley winds shifted like clockwork every 8 minutes. The temperature swing between daylight and darkness changed air density enough to nudge around off target. And while the M1903 Springfield could reach out to 800 yards on a calm range, this wasn't a calm range. This was an attempt to send a projectile the length of 5 football fields, thread it through a gap the size of a coin, then have it strike steel at the exact point needed to redirect into a man Keller had never even seen. It was less a shot and more an equation, one with fatal consequences if he miscalculated. On 14th March 1944, at 11:15 a.m., Keller slid into his chosen firing position. He had selected the ruins of a collapsed farmhouse exactly 480 yards from Strong Point 7, aligned at the calculated bearing of 247 degrees. From the second-story wreckage, he gained roughly 34 feet of elevation, close enough to match his equations. He cleared a narrow firing lane through the shattered stone and splintered beams, then settled into a prone position among the dust and broken plaster. The stench hit him immediately. The sharp bite of aviation fuel from a burned-out transport, mixed with the sickly sweetness of bodies that had been lying in no man's land far too long. It was the smell of a battlefield that refused to let anything die cleanly. The stone floor pressed cold against his chest despite the afternoon heat bleeding through the broken roof. His hands carried the faint mix of gun oil and the eggs he'd choked down at breakfast, a strangely ordinary scent in the middle of a battlefield. He pulled the rifle tight into his shoulder, exhaled once, and looked through the scope. The bunker filled the glass, a dull slab of gray concrete with its firing slit carved into the center like a black, unblinking eye. And above it, almost invisible unless you knew it was there, lay the narrow beam gap, 3 inches of darkness where steel and wall didn't quite meet. The first problem presented itself immediately. The gap wasn't level. The I-beam had been fitted with a subtle rise on the left, maybe 2 degrees. That tiny imperfection would change the ricochet, so Keller shifted his aim roughly 6 inches to the right to compensate for the altered angle of deflection. The second problem was worse. He couldn't see the German observer at all. He couldn't confirm where the man stood, couldn't measure the exact interior distance, couldn't know if his geometry would hold even if he struck the beam dead center. He was sighting in on a theory, one that offered no second chances. The entire plan existed only on paper. Morrison had died relying on certainties. Keller was wagering lives on trigonometry worked out with a borrowed protractor. His thumb throbbed, a cut from a C-ration can that morning, constantly snagged on the rifle stock. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and the scope's eye relief cast a faint shadow ring that made perfect alignment even more difficult. He chambered around, the bolt clicking sharply, impossibly loud in the stillness. Somewhere across the valley, German soldiers were going about their ordinary routines, eating lunch, writing letters home, cleaning their weapons, completely unaware that a single shot could rewrite their fate. One of those men sat inside that bunker, scanning the valley floor, ready to summon artillery the moment an American unit dared to move. The equation was brutal but clear. If Keller succeeded, the German spotter would die. If he failed, more Americans would be buried trying the same doomed tactics. Keller had grown up Catholic, had knelt in a confessional before shipping out, told by a priest that killing in war was not the same as murder. But now, lying in the rubble, with a rifle aimed at a stranger he couldn't even see, preparing to end a life with a ricochet calculated like a pool shot, that spiritual assurance felt thin, fragile, almost theoretical. Morrison's little girl would never get the summer her father promised. Chen's fiancée, Dorothy, had already opened the envelope that ended her future. Donovan's mother had stood over a grave 3 days earlier, burying the only child she had left. Keller tightened the scope's focus, bringing the beam gap into perfect clarity. The wind had fallen still, a rare mercy. The temperature held steady. The air was clean, sharp, and unmoving for the first time in days. Every variable lined up exactly as his calculations required. He drew a slow breath, felt his heartbeat steady, and in the quiet space between pulses, he pressed the trigger. The M1903 slammed against his shoulder as the shot fired, its report flat and cutting across the valley. Through the scope, Keller tracked the bullet's fleeting vapor trail for a heartbeat before it vanished into the beam gap. Then came silence, no secondary sound, no splash, no hint of impact. The bunker remained as it had been, unmoving, unyielding. The firing slit was just a dark rectangle against the gray concrete. Strong point 7 appeared unchanged, exactly as it had 30 seconds earlier. Keller stayed still, following standard sniper discipline, waiting for the next moment to reveal whether his calculation had worked or failed. After firing, Keller didn't move. 60 seconds of stillness were standard procedure. Any motion could draw return fire. Even a missed shot demanded frozen patience, careful observation, and preparation for the next move. He pressed his eye to the scope, scanning for the slightest change. 20 seconds passed. Nothing. 30 seconds. A gentle breeze stirred the dead grass below. 40 seconds. A bird landed on the bunker roof, pecked briefly at some debris, and flew off. Then, at 47 seconds, the rear door of the bunker creaked open. The shot had done exactly what Keller had calculated. He stayed in position for another 8 minutes, eyes locked on the bunker, observing every movement around it. Slowly, the Germans evacuated the position entirely. No new observer took the post. By 1:15 p.m., Strong Point 7 stood empty and silent. For the first time in 3 weeks, the valley floor was no longer under precise enemy artillery observation. 20 minutes later, Captain Hayes found Keller still prone in the rubble. "Did you take that shot?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Keller replied. Hayes studied the abandoned bunker for a long moment before nodding. "The Germans have abandoned Strong Point 7. An infantry patrol was advancing now to verify the outcome." "Yes, sir," Keller confirmed. Hayes studied him, his hands shaking as he struck a match and lit a cigarette. "How certain are you that you hit?" he asked. 90%, sir. Maybe 95. Hayes exhaled, muttering, "Jesus." He ran a hand across his face. "Do you realize what you just did? This violates every sniper doctrine we teach." "Yes, sir," Keller replied calmly. "I fired at a target I couldn't even see, using a deflection technique that isn't in any manual. Geometry most soldiers couldn't calculate with a protractor in 3 hours." Hayes drew a long drag on the cigarette, his eyes narrowing. Then the patch came through. Confirmation. The German observer was dead, a single gunshot wound, traveling downward. Entry through the upper chest, exit through the lower abdomen. "Exactly as you described," Hayes said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "They're calling it impossible. The intelligence officer even thinks the Germans accidentally shot their own man." Keller said nothing, but both of them knew the truth. Hayes flicked the ash from his cigarette. "I'm not putting this in any report, Corporal. If I document what you just did, some general will order every sniper in Italy to try trick shots like this. 99% of them will fail, and good men will die trying to replicate something that shouldn't work." "Understood, sir," Keller replied. Hayes met his gaze steadily. "But if someone asks how you did it, you tell them. If another sniper wants to learn it, you teach them, quietly, off the books. We need this skill, but we can't turn it into doctrine," Hayes said. "Yes, sir," Keller replied. Hayes let the last inch of his cigarette fall, crushing it under his boot. "Morrison, he would have wanted to see this. He always said you saw the battlefield differently than the rest of us." "Morrison was a good man, sir." "He was." Hayes started to walk away, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, Corporal, you saved lives today. Dozens, maybe hundreds. No one's going to pin a medal on you for what you just pulled off, but you did the right thing." "Thank you, sir." After Hayes left, Keller remained alone in the shattered farmhouse. His hands trembled, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a weight of exhaustion and something harder to name, a hollow mix of grief, relief, and the quiet acknowledgement that he had just proven the Army's lessons on direct fire were incomplete. Morrison was still dead, Chen was still dead, Donovan was still dead, but perhaps the next German observation post would no longer demand 3 lives to silence. That evening, a corporal from Baker Company spotted Keller in the chow line. "Heard you took out Strong Point 7. Word travels fast. How'd you do it?" Keller hesitated, remembering Hayes's order. "If someone asks, you tell them." He drew a slow breath. "You know those bunkers have I-beams supporting the roof?" The corporal nodded. "There's a gap where the beam meets the wall, about 3 inches. If you hit that spot at the right angle, the round deflects off the inner surface of the beam and drops straight into the bunker." The corporal stared, stunned. Keller just shrugged. "Simple physics, ugly physics, but it works." The corporal stared at him. "You're telling me you banked a rifle shot off steel?" Keller shrugged. "Geometry, same principle as banking a pool shot off the rail. The corporal shook his head. "That's insane." "That's physics," Keller said. Silence settled between them before the corporal asked, "Could you teach someone to do that? If they can do math, understand angles?" Keller raised an eyebrow. "I can do math," the corporal added quickly. "Baker Company's got 3 snipers. We've been trying to crack strong point 12 for a week. Same setup as 7. Offset firing slit, concrete walls, observer under deep cover." Keller studied him for a long moment. "You got a protractor?" "I can get one." Keller nodded. "Meet me after chow. Bring your rifle and something to write on." By morning, 4 snipers had learned Keller's beam gap technique. By afternoon, that number had grown to 7. No one called it indirect fire or deflection shooting. Those were officer terms that could draw unwanted attention. Among the enlisted ranks, it spread under simpler names: the gap shot, Keller's angle, or just a trick. On March 16, 1944, Baker Company's Sergeant Thomas Riley prepared to take on Strong Point 2, a German observation bunker of reinforced concrete with an offset firing slit, an identical setup to Strong Point 7. Riley had spent 2 hours with Keller the night before, learning to identify structural gaps, calculate deflection angles, and account for the precise positioning of beams. At 2:47 p.m., from a distance of 510 yards, Riley took his shot. The round slipped through the beam gap, glanced perfectly off the I-beam, and struck the German observer in the head. Strong Point 12 went silent. That afternoon, Baker Company advanced 400 yards without a single artillery strike disrupting their movement. That evening, every sniper in the 36th Infantry Division wanted to know how Riley had pulled it off. The technique spread quietly. No official reports, no training manuals, no engineering analyses, just whispered conversations in foxholes, rough diagrams scratched into the dirt, snipers teaching fellow snipers the geometry their instructors had never imagined. By March 20th, 15 snipers were attempting beam gap shots, and 8 had succeeded. 7 snipers had missed, but each failure became a lesson. They refined their calculations and prepared to try again. The Germans took notice first. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, March 22, 1944. Intelligence reports recovered after the war noted an alarming development: American snipers demonstrating an unprecedented ability against fortified observation positions. 3 bunkers had been neutralized in just 5 days by a method that remained unknown to enemy commanders. Casualties included 3 observers and 2 forward artillery coordinators. The report concluded with a stark recommendation: immediate tactical review. German combat engineers combed through the abandoned bunkers and found bullet impacts in the most unlikely places. Rounds were embedded in I-beams, trajectories meticulously traced, revealing the Americans' ingenious method. But knowing the technique didn't make it any easier to counter. The beam gaps were structural necessities. Removing them would have required a complete redesign of every bunker. German doctrine had no choice but to adapt. Observation posts received new orders: position observers further back from the firing slits, doubling the distance from 6 to 12 feet. This reduced their visibility of the battlefield, made artillery coordination less precise, and slowed response times. The psychological effect on the Americans far outweighed the physical toll. On March 27th, Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, a decorated German sniper with 43 confirmed kills, encountered the beam gap technique. His after-action report noted he was positioned at the optimal counter-sniper location, yet there was still no direct line to the enemy. An American round had entered a structural gap long considered non-threatening, deflected downward, and struck the German observer Gerarder Kahl. Immediate withdrawal followed. This marked a fundamental evolution in American sniper capability. By April 1, 1944, German forward positions were receiving artillery support 20% slower than before March 14th, and American advances encountered far less accurate fire. Casualty rates in the 36th Infantry Division during offensive operations in the Rapido Valley dropped from 37% to 23%. Yet no one at headquarters fully understood why the recognition came silently rather than through formal channels. In late April, a colonel from Army Intelligence arrived at the 36th Division, conducting interviews, inspecting abandoned German positions, and reviewing casualty reports. The colonel filed a classified assessment noting a remarkable improvement in counter-observation capabilities, attributing it to enhanced sniper training and better intelligence on enemy fortifications. Keller's name appeared nowhere in the report. By May 1944, the technique had spread to the British 8th Army. A British sniper, Geoffrey Morrison, no relation to William Morrison, successfully neutralized a German observation post near Monte Cassino using the same beam gap deflection method. When his commanding officer asked how he'd learned the technique, Morrison simply replied, "Some Yank corporal showed me at a supply depot. Never caught his name." From there, the method traveled quietly across the war. After D-Day, it surfaced in France, where American snipers in the hedgerows of Normandy used it against German pillboxes buried into the bocage. No one recorded success rates. No one wrote down the calculations. The technique lived in the unofficial spaces between doctrine, passed hand to hand, from soldier to soldier, through whispered explanations, crude sketches, and field demonstrations. Conservative estimates suggest that beam gap sniper shots neutralized at least 127 fortified observation positions between March 1944 and May 1945. Each neutralized position represented roughly 3 American lives spared, 3 soldiers who didn't fall in hopeless assaults, 3 families who didn't receive a telegram edged with grief. By that math, 381 lives were saved by geometry the Army had never thought to teach. In June 1944, the Army War College received an anonymous technical paper titled Structural Deflection in Counterfortification Sniper Operations. It outlined the beam gap method in exact engineering language, complete with formulas for calculating deflection angles and meticulously drawn diagrams that mapped out what frontline snipers were doing by instinct and borrowed protractors. The report recommended that the method be integrated into official sniper doctrine, but it sat untouched in a file cabinet for 7 months. Only in January 1945 did the Army authorize a formal training program. They called it Advanced Structural Analysis for Counter-Fortification Operations, a polished name for the same technique Keller had invented in a pool hall and refined using cigarette packages and a borrowed protractor. The curriculum copied his geometry, his logic, his angles, but never once mentioned his name. Keller received no commendation, no promotion, no acknowledgement of the innovation that quietly reshaped sniper warfare. His record noted expert marksman and 19 confirmed kills, and nothing about the doctrine he'd rewritten from the shadows. It didn't matter to him. Morrison was still dead. Chen was still dead. Donovan was still dead. But 381 others were alive, men with families and futures, because the math had worked. That was enough. James Keller survived the war. Keller returned to Charlestown in November 1945, just 24, carrying a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds at Monte Cassino and memories of Morrison's final expression that haunted his dreams. The dock jobs had gone to men who'd stayed behind. The pool hall was under new management. he found work as a crane operator at the Navy Yard, the very job he'd left in 1942. The work was familiar: calculating load weights, reading stress angles, positioning rigging points with precision. No one asked about the war, and Keller volunteered no stories. In 1947, he married Catherine O'Brien, a nurse from Chelsea Naval Hospital, and they had 3 children. Keller taught them to play pool, showed them how to calculate angles, and explained that straight lines were only one way to solve a problem. He never spoke of why he understood deflection better than most. He worked at the Navy Yard for 32 years, retiring in 1977 at age 56 with a pension and a reputation as Boston's finest crane operator. Keller spent his retirement fishing at Nahant Beach, playing pool at the VFW Hall, and taking his grandchildren to Red Sox games. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 77 from complications of emphysema. His obituary in the Charlestown Patriot Bridge ran just 140 words. It mentioned his service at the Navy Yard, his family, his love of baseball, but only one sentence touched on his wartime service. James served with distinction in World War II, participating in campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. There was no mention of strong point 7, no hint of beam gap deflection, and nothing about the 381 lives that his ingenuity had quietly saved. The technique he pioneered eventually became standard doctrine. Modern sniper schools now teach structural deflection shooting as a fundamental skill. Soldiers learn to spot beam gaps, calculate deflection angles, and exploit architectural weaknesses in fortified positions, just as Keller once had in a ruined Italian farmhouse. The official curriculum acknowledges that the method emerged during World War II, but gives no credit to any individual. Decades later, in 2003, military historian Dr. Lorraine Patricia Williamson began researching sniper innovations from the Italian campaign, tracing scattered accounts, field reports, and fragmented testimonies that hinted at a single unnamed corporal whose geometry had changed the battlefield. Dr. Williamson uncovered references to gap shooting in German intelligence reports from March 1944. By cross-referencing casualty records, after-action reports, and survivor interviews, she traced the method back to the 36th Infantry Division and ultimately to a single, decisive shot at strong point 7 by a corporal named James Keller. Her findings were published in the Journal of Military History, spanning 14 pages of meticulous research. Yet no one from Keller's family ever saw it. His widow had passed away in 2001, and the recognition arrived too late for those who knew him best. His children didn't read military history journals. The innovation that saved hundreds of lives, that revolutionized sniper doctrine, that spread across armies and continents, had originated with a Boston dock worker who'd learned to think in angles while playing pool for quarters. That's how innovation actually happens in war. By cross-referencing casualty records, after-action reports, and survivor interviews, she traced the method back to the 36th Infantry Division and ultimately to a single, decisive shot at strong point 7 by a corporal named James Keller. Her findings were published in the Journal of Military History, spanning 14 pages of meticulous research. Yet no one from Keller's family ever saw it. His widow had passed away in 2001, and the recognition arrived too late for those who knew him best. His children didn't read military history journals. The innovation that saved hundreds of lives, that revolutionized sniper doctrine, that spread across armies and continents, had originated with a Boston dock worker who'd learned to think in angles while playing pool for quarters. That's how innovation actually happens in war. True change comes from men who understand that rules are written by people who weren't there, that doctrine is authored by officers who don't pull triggers, and that sometimes the difference between death and survival is 3 inches of shadow, the courage to take an impossible shot. Keller never called himself a hero, never claimed credit, and never sought recognition. He simply did what needed to be done. Morrison's daughter never learned to fish with her father, but other daughters did, and that was enough. Keller rests in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett, Massachusetts. His headstone is standard military issue: name, rank, dates of service. Nothing hints at the innovation he pioneered. Nothing acknowledges the hundreds of lives saved. Just gray marble, green grass, and the occasional flag on Memorial Day. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to explore more untold histories, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from.